Good morning to all the participants. On behalf of the Brazilian Air Force University and its commander and chancellor, Lieutenant General Max Sintra Moreira, we welcome all of you to the International Space Security webinar, Building a Sustainable Future. All the manifestations expressed by the speakers and the audience who are taking part of this event and the online broadcasts represent exclusively the opinions of their authors and do not necessarily portray the institutional position of the Brazilian Air Force University and the Brazilian Air Force Command. We also reiterate that everyone at this seminar agreed to participate in it spontaneously. Therefore, they authorize the use of their image for this broadcasting, which will be available later on the official YouTube channel of the Brazilian Air Force University. Certificates pertaining to this event will be sent to the emails informed at the time of registration only to those participants that confirm their presence through the link which is located in the video description. Participants may send their questions to the speakers by clicking on the access link to the Slido platform, which is located in the video description. Lectures will take place without interruptions for questions. Accordingly, there will be 3 talks that will last about 20 minutes, followed by a discussion, and after that, we will have a 10-minute break. Finally, there will be 2 more talks and another moment for discussion. We request all speakers to continue logged in at the end of their presentations in order to participate in the debates. To officially begin this event, we would like to invite the Lieutenant General Max Sintra Moreira to proceed with the opening of the webinar. Welcome, General.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and distinguished guests, it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to the International Webinar on Space Security. Today, we gather to explore and discuss the crucial role Brazil plays in the field of space security. The Center for Strategic Studies of the Air Force University has been instrumental in organizing and publicizing this event. We are honored to have the opportunity to engage with experts from leading research institutions both from Brazil and the United States of America. I'm confident that the topics discussed today will reach our perspectives and contribute to shaping the future of space security on a global scale. Moving forward with this event, I officially open the International Webinar on Space Security. Thank you.
We would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Peter Hayes, professor at George Washington University, with the theme Space Security as an Issue of National Security and International Relations. Welcome, Professor.
Good morning. It's a great privilege to be with you this morning. And I should just mention, I had the honor of teaching Bruno Martini at the George Washington University last year. And I also had the privilege of teaching at the American United States Air Force Academy in Colorado back during the 1980s and 1990s. So it's really a great honor and privilege to be with you this morning. Next slide, please. You're going to hear a lot of really exciting things about what's going on in space, particularly with a lot of commercial space developments. But I think for military members, it's particularly important to know what space contributes to modern warfare. I think the next 3 slides help to explain that. So not that long ago, most analysts thought that war was best described as a battle of attrition, where forces went after one another. They didn't really know where the other militaries were located. There was a lot of heavy collateral damage, mass bombing raids, burning down cities, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. About the time of the 1991 Operation Desert Storm, which a coalition resoundingly defeated Iraq in the defense of Kuwait, things started to change pretty radically. And we saw that space enabled a means of warfare that had never before seen, which really emphasized the ability to strike targets very, very precisely and really limit collateral damage to levels not ever seen before. But of course, that's a generation ago now. Next slide. And today we see that in hybrid warfare, there's an ever increasing dependence and reliance on space. Almost all of the munitions used are guided by space systems. All of the communications for any telecommunications contributing to the operation are from space systems. And unlike what happened just one generation ago, most aircraft take off without an assigned target. They are assigned a target during the course of their sortie. So all of that is radically different than just the operations of 20 years ago. Next slide, please. So I know this is a bit of an eye chart. It's derived from a book called On Space Warfare by David Lupton in 1988. So David Lupton taught at the American Air University in Alabama. And what his book and thinking illustrates is that there's a variety of ways to conceptualize how space can contribute to strategic stability. And he labeled 4 schools of thought about that. You can see that in the far left column: sanctuary, survivability, control, and high ground. And then he said, well, if you believe any of those concepts, how would you, what major functions would military forces perform under each of those schools? So those are the columns to the right of those 4 schools of thought. So under the sanctuary school, this was the original concept that the United States followed back beginning in the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. And it saw space primarily as a way to understand what was going on in the Soviet Union. The value of space systems in opening up the otherwise closed Soviet state was tremendously valuable and helped to stabilize the superpower relationship. But those types of concepts really are difficult to adhere to today because, as we know, space can provide so many more things for warfare, as I just talked about in the last 3 slides. So the next schools of thought, survivability, control, and high ground, expand on those contributions of space and start envisioning that there are more and more contributions that space can make to military operations. So the second column over from the schools of thought talks about how you're going to employ space forces. The survivability school emphasizes that space systems tend to be more fragile and easily disrupted or destroyed than most military forces, which can be hardened and maneuvered away from attacks. That's difficult to do with space systems. So the primary operating concept under the survivability school is that the space forces need to really work on ways that they can operate more resiliently and not fail catastrophically if they come under attack. Going to also call that graceful degradation, as you see in the next column over. That would be the major contribution of Space Forces under the Survivability School. And also the final column to the right talks about what are the optimal ways to have a organization to advocate and operate under these concepts. So for the Sanctuary School, the United States created the National Reconnaissance Office in 1961, and they primarily support the intelligence community. They also support the military, but in many ways, it's not a strictly military function in the way that space contributes in the other schools of thought. So you can see control is the next category down. That's similar to the way militaries operate in other domains, where the primary function is to control freedom of access and freedom of operation in those domains, while also denying those capabilities to the enemy. And then the final school of thought says that space is like the high ground on Earth. Militaries normally try to take the high ground and make their enemy fight uphill during the battles. So if space is the high ground, then it can dominate over other domains of military operations. It can contribute in very, very significant ways. And you can see also that if you're going to organize around that type of force, then you probably need a Space Corps or a Space Force. And of course, the United States created a Space Force in 2019. Next slide, please. This shows some of those same concepts, but with the actual operations included. So this traces about the last 20 years of U.S. military operations. There's a disagreement about what exactly to call these new capabilities. Some say it's the new American way of war. This kind of clunky phrase, reconnaissance strike complex, was actually coined from the Soviet General Staff back in the late 1970s. So they were actually the first to conceptualize about that. Fortunately for the United States, they've had a great deal of difficulty in operationalizing that. But we see increasingly that munitions are now delivered via space-enabled systems. And whereas in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, only about 7 or 8% of the total munitions used were precision guided, in the coming 20 years, we've seen a transition that all munitions for any significant target are enabled by space guidance. We also know where the targets are because of space systems. We know whether we struck the target successfully. And to guide all of the operations and do the command and control required, majority of that is provided by space telecommunication systems. So it's really a very comprehensive level contributing to all aspects of modern military space operations. And this focuses on how the United States has operated, but we see a general trend worldwide, particularly on the part of the Chinese, to develop these same types of systems. Next slides. And I don't expect anyone to get all of this. I know it's another eye chart, but I wanted to highlight to you that for the United States, it's devoted a lot of effort and has deployed many space systems to support it in these 5 major space mission areas. So you can see that those are environmental monitoring, what's going on in space, where do those satellites operate, primarily in polar low Earth orbit, and then below that are the actual satellites themselves. There's also a dashed line, and below that there's systems listed in yellow and white. The yellow systems are programs of record that have subsequently been canceled, and then the white systems below the dashed line are future systems that will be deployed. So you can see the major mission areas. In addition to environmental monitoring, we have satellite communications. Those are the most proliferated systems in space today. And you can see a lot of dedicated military systems, as well as an increasing number of commercial systems. And you're probably familiar with Elon Musk's Starlink system. That is of growing importance. Over 5,000 satellites in low Earth orbit are supporting that. And in the Ukraine war, that has proven to be the single most important capability supporting the Ukrainians, because without that, it's doubtful that they would have been as successful as they have been in countering the Russian invasion. The Russians were actually quite successful at taking out the legacy space systems of the Ukrainians, but thus far they've been unable to take out the Ukrainian use of the Starlink system. Mr. Musk decided that early on in the conflict, he was going to deliver those capabilities for free to the Ukrainians. So again, it's over 5,000 satellites in low Earth orbit that is supporting that. He also gave the Ukrainians over 10,000 ground stations that can receive the signals from Starlink systems. So again, that's super important for the Ukrainian defense of their country. The next column over, positioning, navigation, and timing, another really critical capability, not just for the military, but really for all modern telecommunications, and providing a timing signal that's used worldwide. The United States Global Positioning System is the world's gold standard for those capabilities, but we see increasingly that many other states have developed and deployed similar types of capabilities. Missile warning and missile tracking, missile defense is another specific capability that's supported from space primarily. And the United States has deployed those kind of systems since the 1960s. And probably the greatest work for future systems is ongoing in support of this mission, because we see an increasing number of enemy systems that are being developed to support those kinds of operations. Finally, the column that I can talk the least about, because many of these systems are classified, we normally use the acronym ISR for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. Those are operated throughout all orbital regimes. You can see again, there are many types of systems. Those are primarily operated by the National Reconnaissance Office. And again, we're seeing more and more capabilities, more and more satellites, as well as commercial remote sensing satellites that are supporting this mission as well. Next slide, please. This slide just highlights that, going back to that positioning, navigation, and timing mission area, that GPS is probably the single most important capability in transforming warfare, particularly for air forces, because as this slide highlights, from a single B-17 sortie using, I'm sorry, not a single, but very large sorties, 1,500 planes, they couldn't really accurately target what they were going after during the Second World War very effectively. In fact, the average bomb during the Second World War, it was revealed in later studies, the Joint Strategic Bombing Survey found that the average bomb in Europe missed its target by 5 miles, even though they were trying very hard to do precision bombing. So today, thanks largely to GPS, that's a thing of the past. Today's weapons, if they work correctly and we know where the target is, they hit the target. And that creates a radical transformation in warfare. It's certainly the case that a single F-117 sortie, as we saw in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, can have more effectiveness than those 1,500 B-17s in actually destroying the target that they're going after. And going towards the future, as future weapons platforms can carry more and more smaller bombs, they're actually able to have much more effectiveness than the entire air fleet of not that long ago. So again, this is a radical transformation, and it highlights how important GPS is for modern military operations. I would also, again, tell you that this is not just for military operations. Probably the single most important contribution of GPS worldwide is its timing signal, because GPS is very accurate, it's very reliable, and it's free. So network engineers around the world have chosen to make the GPS timing signal the timing standard for their networks. And this is what enables networks to communicate with one another, to perform the so-called handshake between telecommunications networks. Additionally, all major financial transactions are provided a date, time, location stamp that enables the traders on places like Wall Street to know that these are legitimate transfers of money, and we're talking about billions and billions of dollars really every second that's transferred and is legitimized by that location, date, time stamp provided by GPS. So that's a critical capability. Next slide, please. You're probably going to hear quite a bit about this issue, which is the growth in orbital debris. This chart is produced by the NASA Orbital Debris Office in Houston, Texas, the Johnson Space Flight Center. And you can see that it's quite an alarming trend. As we go forward, almost a straight line going up. So as we think about space security and the sustainability of space operations, this is really a key challenge. I will highlight to you that there are a couple of lines indicated with a 1 and a 2. Those represent direct ascent anti-satellite tests conducted by the Chinese, number 1, and the Russians, number 2. So these events create a lot of debris. They are the single most important way that debris is created, particularly in low Earth orbit. And that is why the United States has now led a international effort where beginning in 2022, the United States pledged that it would not create this kind of orbital debris by testing direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. And to date, 155 countries in the United Nations General Assembly agreed that this should not be done. And a number of states, I believe it's up close to 40 now, have made unilateral pledges that they will not conduct these kinds of operations. So that's quite important for limiting the growth of debris in low Earth orbit. And we are hopeful that we can continue on with that and find even more well-developed and fulsome ways to limit the growth in debris. Next slide, please. And again, I apologize that these are somewhat of an eye chart as well. These following slides are derived from the Secure Worlds Foundation's annual report on worldwide counterspace weapons. And they're just showing all of the types of weapons that various states, China, Russia, next slide, please, the United States and India have developed and tested. So you can see in general, there's a lot of growth in this. That's probably one of the most alarming trends in overall space security, is that there are more and more of these systems that are able to attack other things in space. And the strategic implications of this go well beyond just the debris that I mentioned. That is created by a particular type of counterspace weapon, but there are a variety of other means of countering or destroying space systems that don't necessarily create debris. Next slide, please. A final thing I'd like to touch on is what you may have heard about, that the United States has publicly indicated that the Russians are developing and may soon launch a nuclear weapon and station it in low Earth orbit. This is a really significant development because, for one thing, it's a direct violation of their obligations under Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, which the Soviet Union was one of the primary architects of that agreement that was signed back in 1967. And why did the signatories want to have this ban on nuclear weapons in low Earth orbit? It's because if a nuclear weapon is detonated in low Earth orbit, it enhances the natural radiation that's found around Earth, and it increases the peak radiation flux in parts of the Van Allen radiation belts by 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. This slide shows the naturally occurring radiation. Next slide, please. So this is telling you what the radiation will be following a single nuclear detonation in low Earth orbit. And so what you need to understand is that that single nuclear weapon will disable and eventually cause the failure of every satellite in low Earth orbit. If they are specifically hardened against this kind of attack, there's a possibility that they may continue to operate for something approaching their design life of years. But for everything else, and no satellites are known to be hardened against this effect. So for all those other satellites, for example, those 5,000 plus SpaceX Starlink satellites, those will all fail in weeks to months. So the initial economic impact of this is about $500 billion, and the overall economic impact to the global economy is estimated to be about $3 trillion. So this is a really significant event, and you can see why the United States and all spacefaring actors, and really the world community, is very concerned about why the Russians would place such a weapon in low Earth orbit, and particularly concerned that they can deter its use. So I'm going to stop my presentation then. I will look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Question. We would like to thank you, Dr. Peter Hayes, for the knowledge provided, and we also invite you to stay with us. We will now begin the second lecture by Dr. John Klein, professor at George Washington University, who will speak about the topic Space Warfare, Principles and Strategies. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me. So good morning or good afternoon, whenever you're viewing this recording. It is a deep honor to speak with you today, and it's always wonderful to follow the great Dr. Pete Hayes when he lectures. So Dr. Hayes really set up the past and current environment for space when we consider competition and conflict. So this really dovetails well into my points. Next slide, please. So a little bit about myself. I have a day job that pays the bills, developing service level space strategy. But for the folks on the panel or anyone out there that teaches, one of the most rewarding things I do is I get to teach space policy and strategy courses at a few places in the Washington, D.C. area at the undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral levels. I always tell my students I don't really teach a space policy class. I teach a policy class that focuses on space. You can't disassociate space by itself because it has such a big impact terrestrially, politically, with regards to competition between states, as Pete kind of laid out before. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about myself. I've been thinking about strategic theory, principles, or strategy for space warfare or conflict in space. I'm an old US Navy person, so I started off at the Naval War College. I wrote my first paper called Corbett in Orbit. It uses the strategic principles of Julian Corbett, who was a British academic in the early 1900s, a contemporary of Alfred Thayer Mahan. So I used his work to kind of shape what are the principles of conflict or warfare in space. So if the article in the first book, which expounded upon that article, is known as Corbett in Orbit, I would say the book Understanding Space Strategy would be also known as Corbett is Not Enough. You can't really take one strategic thinker and realistically think that they're going to apply to all type of situations. So that book includes the works of Karl von Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, J.C. Wiley, Thucydides, B.H. Littleheart, and others. So it's kind of expounds it off because all these strategic principles, fundamentally space is just another domain for potential competition or conflict, even though we hope not on the conflict side. You can take all these principles and you can kind of think about them for the space domain. In the last book, Fight for the Final Frontier, I was reading a friend of mine's book, B.J. Armstrong, who's a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, and he wrote a book, Small Boats, Daring Men, which basically the main thesis was that the early U.S. Navy was an irregular fighting force. And given my past history, it was kind of like an aha moment. Maybe we can use irregular warfare model to think about current competition. And we can go more into that. So thank you. Next slide, please. Also, I had the distinct privilege to study under the late Colin Gray for my PhD while he was at the University of Reading. Whenever I get very full of myself and pontificate and think that I have written a lot, I remember Dr. Gray, he wrote over 30 monographs or books and over 200, 300 shorter pieces and articles. So he was influenced a lot by Clausewitz, Thucydides, Sun Tzu. Consequently, a lot of my writing was too. So these are enduring principles. The next slide. So Pete laid out the current state of affairs. I kind of struggled in recent years. So whether it was Julian Corbett, Clausewitz, Mahan, or whoever, what we were seeing in the space domain wasn't conflict. It wasn't the use of force or armed conflict in a United Nations charter sense, but it certainly wasn't really peace either. I mean, we have ongoing jamming and lasing going on in the space domain. We have direct descent anti-satellite testing that's been going on. We have GPS jamming in Ukraine on both sides. Debris generation, I would say the Russia's most recent anti-satellite testing was purposeful debris generation because they really understand the problem better than most. Then we have rendezvous and proximity operations going on in the space domain. Again, the Secure World Foundation reports, the Center for Strategic International Studies reports do a great job of highlighting the different countries' activities going on in space. So for me, what was going on? Why can't, this isn't conflict, armed conflict, but this is something else. So I struggled with that, and we'll touch on that at the end, but that's where the irregular warfare framework has some benefits. Next slide, please. So I use this in my class and I use this in my writing. Space is not special. just wonderfully different. And what do I mean by that? It says, you know, often space has a terrestrial reference, just like everything else. You can't take space and space activities in isolation. You have to provide the greater geopolitical context, the greater political context. So we can look to the other domains on how we've kind of wrestled with some of these enduring issues. Karl von Clausewitz would phrase this differently. He would talk about the enduring nature of war, but the changing character. So again, there's these guiding lights we can look to when we consider what's going on in the space domain. And that's really helpful so we don't lose our way. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about briefly Julian Corbett. That's how I started off my writing on space strategy. Again, he influenced my thinking, and I would say his maritime principles are still enduring. I just want to highlight that the United States Space Force's inaugural Space Capstone publication included a shout out to Julian Corbett from 1911 from his work. So again, even the U.S. Space Force recognizes some of the enduring principles for thinking about competition and conflict in the space domain. So let's talk about some of those principles of Julian Corbett. Next, please. So I'm going to have slides on each one of those, so no need to read about them to you right now. He talks about more than these, but for the sake of brevity for this discussion, I'll just focus on these. You know, a lot of folks in the Space Force, they like to use maritime analogies or refer to Alfred Thayer Mahan, Julian Corbett, which is my thinking, or even some of the European thinkers like Raoul Cassé from France, on some of his continental thinking on what the purpose of maritime forces are, and by extension, space thinking. But we'll go through some of Julian Corbett's thinking now. Next slide. So this is repurposed from Corbett's writings. So just like in the Age of Sail, you needed to have wooden ships or sailing ships, and then you needed to have commerce and trade or have your navies go out. Having a fleet or having shipbuilding capability was not an easy endeavor. It was a decades-long endeavor. So that in itself is pretty significant. And just like in the space domain, having launch capability, being able to get to space is significant. Even though routinely we consider space launch routine, recent events confirm space is hard. It's not routine. We still have failures. And it's not as easy as we would like to think. So getting to space is one thing, and then being able to use it once you're there. So once spacecraft get on orbit, whether it's low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, or geostationary or geosynchronous, you have to be able to use it. So getting there is not enough. So we have jamming and lasing. We can have other type of degrading effects when we consider competition and conflict. So that's also. So the purpose of space strategy is to ensure access to and use of space. If you look at the recent U.S. White House's Space Priorities Framework, you'll see this as the lead off. So this is not a really new thinking. This type of thinking has been around for a while and seminal. Next, please. Okay, so this is one point where my thinking, if you take Corbett's thinking, it diverges from a lot of space superiority thinking in the United States. So Julian Corbett believed because sea lines of communications are so big, the oceans and the seas are so big, you really couldn't exercise what he calls sea control or command of the seas. You could only exercise command or have control over for specific periods of time or in specific locations. You know, the greatest exception to that was potentially Great Britain when Britannia ruled the waves. and the Empire touched all time zones. So that might be the exception, but the most common condition is for sea control, command of the seas to be in dispute. I would say the same holds true for space. You can't achieve space supremacy, space superiority in an absolute sense. Just because space is so big, perhaps we're talking near Earth orbits when we use that phraseology around. Maybe we're using low Earth orbit or specific orbits, and maybe we're implying a specific time frame to that. I know a lot of space superiority thinking came from air superiority, from a logical extension, but I would even postulate then, based on my experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, when they referred to space superiority, they meant over a specific area, right, the joint operating area, and they meant for specific times, hopefully during the whole duration of the campaign. But we can maybe bring that up in the question and answering, and folks can point out the errors of my thinking. So I don't believe these phrases of space dominance or space superiority are overly helpful because they convey an absolute condition. Next, please. So the next is celestial lines of communication. This is a variation of sea lines of communication. For the age of sail, there were trade routes that followed the winds. We had ports. We had preferred trade routes. We had choke points that we would have to go through. Space is similar to that. It's a little bit different because the physics and the orbitology, but there are, we do have primary launch locations for spacecraft. We have orbits that we tend to kind of go into. I would say low Earth orbit is a very popular one now, where most of the spacecraft and satellites are located. The geostationary belt seems to be a celestial line of communication or an orbit that's of primary value. As we think to the moon and cislunar space, maybe there are trajectories out there. So that's helpful. But this is kind of where a good friend of mine, and Dr. Hayes knows him, is Dr. Michael Coyote Smith. He'll say all analogies are wrong, but some are useful. So we need a little bit of variation here. So space is a little bit different because the value it brings is in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the communications that it brings too. So, celestial lines of communication aren't just spacecraft and things and people going to space station. It's also the signals, the transmissions, the data and information routes that are used too, from satellites to the ground. Because satellites move, these lines of communication will move in time also. So it's a little bit different thinking there. Next slide, please. Maritime operations, as Alfred Thayer Mahan and Julian Corbett laid out, are interdependent. So land forces, armies relied on the operations of ships. U.S. Marines need the Navy to get ashore. Space also is interdependent with the other operational domains. Dr. Hayes laid that out. So GPS is used ubiquitously, whether it's Galileo systems, also Beidou on China's side, or GLONASS. The position navigation and timing is very much ubiquitous everywhere. I have this screen at the bottom on our cell phones. Depending on who your provider is, I can get pizzas and tacos delivered to my house courtesy of the U.S. Space Force and its GPS constellation, which I think is truly a miracle. So in Ukraine, we see data services, communication services for military command and control, civilian use of satellite communications too. That's needed. We do see GPS being denied on both sides in Ukraine also. So space, I think, shares this idea too. Next, please. So Karl von Clausewitz and Corbett talk about the purpose of the offensive strategy. Offensive strategy is, Clausewitz would say, has a positive object. Back then they used Newtonian physics to kind of explain strategy and stuff like that with centers of gravity and positive and negative objects. So the offense is to take away something from the adversary that you're fighting. So in that way, it's in the maritime domain, it's sinking ships, it's taking their ports, and stuff like that. So Clausewitz would say at its essence, warfare is about combat. And this is the strategy, the offense that we see. So I have a battleship launching its rounds that can go a very long distance. But in the space domain, we're seeing this too. We have offensive systems, direct descent, hit to kill anti-satellite weapons. We could potentially, you see some speculation of on-orbit systems. We see the debris generated after the cosmos impact. So whenever we do consider these offensive effects, let's consider the kinetic, non-reversible. Just like the maritime domain, space is shared between commercial and all countries. I hope what we would consider a conventional all-out war in space never happens. The U.S. Department of Defense has tenets of responsible behavior when it considers conflict in space. What are the responsible ways, because we're sharing the domain? It takes into account international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, our treaty obligations under the United Nations, and the like. Next, please. So we have offense, defense. This is one area where the writings of Julian Corbett deviated a lot from Mahan. Mahan and Corbett agreed 90% of the time, but there were some differences. Folks like to focus on the differences, but they agreed more than they disagreed. The strategy of the defense. Clausewitz and Corbett write, the defense is the stronger form of action. So this is defensive approaches. What we have here is a picture of me and Dr. Hayes at the county fair. We're in a couple of padded suits. So the defense, we've made preparations. Taking preparations is what Clausewitz calls it. We put on the padded suits. We're going to try to push each other out of the ring. We're not going to hurt each other. We're going to just get hot and sweaty and notice the futility of our actions and go have a cold beer somewhere. So the space community knows this idea as space mission assurance and resilience. So there's a whole long list. Dr. Hayes had that in one of his slides. But those are the preparations that Clausewitz talks about. And if you take these preparations, you can provide defensive effect. And you can convey to potential adversaries the futility of actions. One that's usually used is proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. You can shoot down one, but I got 10,000 other ones. Maybe that conveys the futility of that type of action. So next, please. Corbett writes about cruisers. There was a debate in the early U.S. Navy whether the battleship had priority or whether it was other ships. Corbett advocated because the purpose of maritime strategy was to ensure access and use of the seas. It was actually the cruiser that took priority over the battleship. By extension, I would say guardians are any types of spacecraft that ensure access to and use of space, whether it's proliferated constellations, providing redundant capacity, alternate launch capabilities. Those take priority over the equivalent of the battleship, which would be offensive weapons. Okay, so if you can have so much stuff, if you can ensure access to and use of space, maybe you don't need those more destructive forms. Next, please. A dispersal and concentration. The navies were limited in numbers, but the seas were great. So they would always look to disperse or concentrate effects. Mahan used the analogy of a drove of sheep that would kind of morph and go different locations, but they would maintain a collective will. In the space, we kind of see this too. Space is too big. You can't be everywhere at all times. You're going to have to pick those locations that are most important. You're going to, in times of conflict, need to concentrate effects that could be kinetic, non-kinetic, reversible, irreversible, but you're going to have to need the focus because you don't have enough hardware to be everywhere at all times. Next, please. Okay, strategic positions. We kind of touched on this during the lines of communication discussion. But there are strategic positions that are more valuable than others. They could be human spaceflight launch locations. They could be space stations, antipodal choke points, which has to do with the trajectory of missiles or rockets. But we also have the electromagnetic spectrum. And there's certain electromagnetic spectrum bands that are more desirable than others due to the attenuation of the Earth's atmosphere. So positions can be things that you can see, and then also include the network domain and electromagnetic spectrum. Next, please. So I did talk about space isn't special. So you can draw upon the works of not just Corbett. You can look back over 2,000 years to the writings of Sun Tzu. He wrote on a variety of things, but one of them is seeking asymmetric advantage. As I go down this irregular warfare framework, seeking asymmetric advantage over an opponent is a key tenet of that. Next, please. Another seminal work is the work of B.H. Littleheart. He saw the carnage of the world wars as a waste. He postulated that there's ways to achieve your aims, your political aims, without the carnage or direct force on force that Clausewitz in his interpretation of total war would be. So he proposed the indirect approach. Whenever you read his stuff, he's kind of nebulous and he's hard to pin down on what he means by that. But that's a key component of what we see in competition and in irregular war approaches, seeking to achieve your aims without the direct conflict of traditional warfighting. Next, please. J.C. Wiley was a U.S. naval officer. He wrote a book that detailed both the cumulative strategy and the sequential strategies. The sequential strategy is what we know traditionally during campaign in the World War II Pacific, where they did island hopping. They had to take one island before they could go off to the next island. That's a sequential. I need one victory before the next one comes. But there's another type of victory that can be achieved, and that's through the cumulative strategy. So he says these are the minute accumulation of small events that will achieve strategic effect over time. This is a key component of irregular warfare. It's using time as a weapon or time to your advantage. So the danger of a cumulative strategy is it may look inconsequential, but if you do nothing against a cumulative strategy, you may lose. You may realize the time to act was years or decades before. I would postulate that a lot of the PRC's activities in the South China Sea employ a cumulative strategy to achieve effect over time because it's below the threshold of armed conflict. It's hard for the West to muster a response. Next, please. So Mao Zedong, in his writings, talks about guerrilla warfare, irregular approaches. His idea of protracted strategy includes elements of B.H. Littlehart's indirect approach and also taking time as a weapon or a cumulative strategy approach. He could not compete with the forces of Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, so he sought to attack and retreat. His purpose was to fight and then to fight another day. So you don't want to take on the larger forces head on in sustained conflict. Next, please. So the next one is lawfare. Charlie Dunlap coined this term. I use it in my most recent work, which Charlie Dunlap was kind enough to review. But this has to go with the indirect approach. So lawfare is defined as the intentional distortion and misuse of legal regimes. It can seek to obfuscate, delay. A lot of folks point to the PPWT as seeking to distort and obfuscate what a space weapon is, maybe disingenuous offers to prevent conflict in space. But when we look at what strategy is balancing ends and means, at least in the definition I use. And lawfare is a means to achieve your political aims. China could be using this in the South China Sea when it builds artificial features, trying to dismantle what we conceive as existing lines of sovereign territory and the like. So this is also a means. Next, please. Bruno, how am I doing on time before I keep on? I got a couple more slides.
Oh yeah, we still have about 5 minutes.
Yep. Next, please. Okay, so we talk about competitive endurance in the U.S. Space Force. I like this idea of competition because we're not in conflict. So, you know, irregular warfare is below the threshold of armed conflict usually. That's one definition and approach. But there's this idea of first mover advantage in space. It's been said, we've had 4 stars in the United States that said spacecraft are big, fat, juicy targets. This idea, what Dr. Hayes referred to as this vulnerability of spacecraft. So it's a use it or lose it. You're not going to have your exquisite systems after conflict happens. So first mover advantage or second mover disadvantage. If you wait to move in conflict, it's going to be too late. I disagree with this idea based on the teachings of Clausewitz. So I'll say I have Clausewitz on my side. But I would say this is the current state of affairs because we have unhelpful operational concepts and we have deployed exquisite systems into vulnerable positions. But if you take into account making preparations, which is space mission assurance and resilience, taking all these approaches to think about a intelligent, thoughtful potential adversary instead of just putting stuff out there. This idea, there is no inherent first mover advantage, I believe, in space. It's only because we've let that sell. The analogy I use, most people recognize that in land warfare, the defense is the stronger form of warfare. We have that by fortifications, moats, Hadrian's Wall, whatever it is. So we say, okay, yeah, you can make preparations that gives you benefits to the defense. The problem is we really haven't taken that into account for space. So in colonial times in the United States, when the revolutionaries fought the British, they would line up in an open field and they would trade volley fire back and forth. The 2 officers would go out there and decide as gentlemen who would lob volleys first. Trust me, you did not want to go second. So in that case, I would say in land warfare, the defense is still the stronger form, but they chose an operational concept that just obviated all those advantages. The lessons learned in space, we got to do something likewise. We cannot take operational approaches that take away the inherent value of the defense. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read you these slides. This is my last chapter in the book on the irregular warfare. It proposes solutions. So if irregular warfare is a helpful model to consider today's competition and potential actions below the threshold of armed conflict, here are certain solutions. So there's 10 of them here. What's shaded in blue is important. Those are non-material solutions. So a lot of the things, when we consider competition between the space powers, you can take actions that doesn't require hardware. Sure, you still need to build shiny objects, spacecraft, and have assets. Those are the last 3. But a lot of it has to do with training and education, having a mindset that takes into account protracted warfare, working with allies and partners, and pursuing non-military solutions. So this is, when we consider what the United States and Brazil can do as cooperation, this will be key. And that concludes my remarks, and I look forward to the questions or the future debate.
We thank Dr. John Klein for the knowledge provided, and we also invite you to stay with us. Now we will have the 3rd lecture, whose theme is the Brazilian National Defense Industrial Base in a New Space by PhD Michele Mello, Science Technology Analyst from the Brazilian Space Agency, currently based at the Attorney General's Office. Welcome, Professor.
Hello. Good morning, all. Let me share my presentation here, just a minute. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can, Doctor.
Okay, thank you so much. So, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today discussing space economy, new space, and Brazilian space industry. Well, my name is Michel Melo. I'm economist. I have a PhD in economics with focus in innovation and industrial economics. I'm also a member of the technical committees from International Astronautical Federation. I'm part of the Space Economy Committee, Space Transportation Committee, and the Space Entrepreneurship and Investment Committee. So I prepare here a presentation to talk about a little about what is the space sector, what is the space economy, and how the space sector is organizing in Brazil. So let's go. Let's try here. Oh, oh, here. So the first question we have to do is, what is the space sector? Because it's so hard just to get just one definition. Space sector is so wide that we have difficulty to understand until the sector goes. So when we talk about space technology is so cross-cutting that we need to add various other sectors in our definition. So it's not easy to understand what about we are talking. And talking about space is not just talking about satellite manufacturing, launching manufacturing. We need to understand the downstream sector or the application sector, because this downstream is bigger than all other parts of this sector at all. So here in these slides, I have the definition made by OECD in 2012, but if you read, you can see that is not good enough to describe what is space sector for today. And think about that. It's better to look at, to think space sector in terms of value chain. So when we see this figure, it shows that we have the upstream or manufacturing and launching sector, and downstream or application sector. And we can note that the size and importance of the downstream, it's bigger than the first one. So it's impossible to imagine our daily life without space application, without the spin-offs from space. But we cannot discuss what is space sector today without understand what this sector evolved throughout the years. This figure shows the first phase between the 1950s and the 1970s, when the government was the main driver of the development of the activities. In the 70s, the commercial idea starts to go up with a few number of companies seeing that it would be possible that space sector could be profitable. The costs were decreasing because of the militarization of components. In the beginning of the 20s, we have a turn point with the rise of new space. And here we start to talk about new space. We start to talk about new companies, the changing of SpaceX causes in the sector. But one thing make me think a lot, because everyone talks about new space, but what is new space? Everyone is talking about the costs, about private companies, but it's just that. And we can answer yes and no, yes and no, because the costs and private companies are results of the changing that occurred in the sector. But about what change are we talking about? The main turn point here was the changing in the action way of the government. And in this point, we're talking here about NASA, right? The government, the NASA, lives to be the leader of all phases of the projects. Before, NASA was responsible to decide all the topics about the project, all requirements. the what will be done and how the project will be done, will be developed. With the new space, part of these responsibilities is transferred for the private sector. Today, NASA says what he wants, what they want. And the private sector has the opportunity to discover how to do it. They have freedom to decide how the development is going. So when we talk about new space, we are discussing more about the change in the way that governments participate in the space sector than about the costs. And it is very, very important to understand where space is going for the next year. So costs are decreasing, and this reducing is it's because the new dynamics of the sector. The private companies are more flexible than government, and they can see this analyzing the costs of launching with SpaceX, with the cost of satellite manufacturing that is decreasing too. So it's very important to understand. And after these discussions, what is space economy? Here we have a little definition, right? Space economy is composed for all industry, rockets, satellites, manufacturers, telecommunications, climate change, researchers, data and finance experts, defense, that come together to create the trillion-dollar ecosystems above our heads that make modern-day digital life possible. And this sector is not all. We can add more sectors each day. But when we talk about space economy, we have a few problems because it's complicated to measure space economy. Calculated, it's a bigger problem. We have some difficulties to create a standard pattern to measure the size of space economy. For example, it's hard to identify the downstream sector. The own companies could not see themselves as space companies. So if the economy did see as a space company, how I will tell the company, yay, you are a space economy. I need to add your values inside my calculation. And a major part of space economy is created for this downstream segment. So I need to identify, but today I don't have the instruments to do that. United States, the BAEI have an initiative to measure. It's an amazing initiative, but I try to reply in Brazil, but our internal accounts is different, so it's impossible for me today to reply the methodology. But I'm still trying. I didn't give up yet. Other point is that there is not a specific industrial and commercial code to identify space activities. And we need this international code, this international standard code, so we can compare numbers. So if I have this standard, I can compare space economy in Brazil with space economy in the United States. And today it's impossible. So because that we have different kind of measures. If you want a company from United States, they will say that space economy is about $500 billion. If you look at Euroconsult, that company from Europe, they are going to say that space economy is about $400 billion. So it's impossible that all companies get just one number. Here we have another important point, because we need to think about the inclusion or not inclusion of the defense or military investments. It's possible to identify the defense investment made by United States, for example. The data is available. But we have problems with other countries, such as China, India, for example. So it's impossible to make a good comparison between these countries. And we have a few data that include defense military budget, but sometimes you cannot say just looking the data. So you need to look at the methodology to discover, and we can make a mistake if we don't not pay attention. But let's talk about numbers. I'm an economist, I like numbers. So when we talk about economy, we need to see these numbers in these slides. The total value of space economy in 2023 was a little more than $500 billion. And I will give a close here. So this is not 2023. I just got a number, actualized number for the totally space economy. But looking at 2022 data, the civilian and defense government segments are each one around $30 billion. It's the same, the part of civilian and defense in all space economy, worldwide space economy. But we also can see that the commercial sector is dominant. So it demonstrates what we were discussing yearly, because the participation of private companies in the space sector is rising very, very, very fast. I would like in this slide to call attention for one point. That is the launching segment. It's a small part of the total sector for 2022. It was just $10 billion. It is a reflection of the cost decreasing with the entry of new private companies such as SpaceX, Rocket Labs, for example. And we also can see that the market is concentrated in the downstream segment. So, and here I can think about the Brazilian space program, because since the 80s, Brazil is trying to get a launching center and a launching vehicle. And I also stay thinking about, because it's a little market. We have a restricted budget, and the launching market is just about $10 billion, with the tendency of decreasing because the cost is decreasing, and we have big companies, and the competition is so high. So we have to going on trying to develop a commercial launching vehicle. I don't know, but I will come back in this discussion a little later. Here, so with the reduction in the launching costs and the increasing of the demand for new products and new servers, we have an increase in the number of satellites to be launched in the next year, and we can see that in this slide. And the most part of these new launching satellites is nano satellites. So it's because that we have increasing in the development of small launchings and not big launchers like the big rockets from SpaceX, for example. Here I have a few data from FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, about the license launch made in the last 35 years. And we can see that in these last 35 years, we have been 705 license launches, with SpaceX accounting for 50%. This is the effect of the rise of private companies in the sector. But I want to call attention for FAA just works with the commercial and private part of the launch. So if you have defense or military launching, SpaceX do nothing. It's not part of FAA to look at, to license this flight, to authorize the flight. And here in Brazil, in the future, I think we are going on to the same kind of practice, because today Brazilian Space Agency is an entity responsible for the policy space. So today, Brazilian Space Agency is responsible to coordinate, to define the regulations, to define the policy. But when we have established space market here in Brazil, Brazilian Space Agency could not do the policy and the regulation at the same time. So I'm here thinking that in the future, Brazilian Space Agency will be divided in two entities, two different entities. One is going to do the work that the FAA does today, and another will be responsible for just the part of the policymaker. Okay. I like very much this slide. Here we can look at the world government expenditures for space program in 2023. And we can see that the United States is in first place. Civilian and military and defense expenditures are more than $70 billion. And here we can see what I said before. The numbers of China, for example, is without military values, is without defense values. Looking at Brazil, our country spent $47 billion in space, civilian and defense budget together. But it's not reflect the reality, because the budget suffers several cuts through the years. And we have a little help about the exchange rate for 2023, but it's a lower budget. We can see here in this slide, Oman has a budget of $23 billion. Myanmar has $11 billion. Philippines has a budget of $21 billion. So they are countries without any experience in the space sector. This is starting your career in the space sector. And here in Brazil, we start our activities in the 60s. We were on the main nations working in space in the last 50 years. But space policy is not a state policy here in Brazil. We don't have the budget enough. We don't have the workforce enough. Space policy here is not a priority. But going on. So here we have a few more information, but I'm not sure about the time, so you can read just a few information about the slide before that. And speaking a little more about Brazilian space sector that I was talking earlier here. Brazil started working in space in the 60s. Launching vehicles being developed by military institutions and satellites being developed by civilian government institutions. National Institute for Space Research, INPE. INPE was created in the middle of the 70s, and the Brazilian Space Agency was created just in 1994 as a civilian coordinate of the space sector. But the problem is the agency was born small, very small, and without decision power. So the agency didn't have budget or workforce to make what were expected. And institutions like Air Force and INPE continue their leadership positions. So, and it's very hard to give the power back, the power decision back, when we stay 30 years with no workforce enough to make the policy goes on. and without budget. So it's a very, very hard position for Brazilian space agencies. And in terms of governance, we have a little confused environment here in Brazil because we have several instances were created. We have the National Space Council that is linked with the Presidency of the Republic. We have the National System for the Development of Space Activities, SINDAI, and AEB was the coordinator. And we have Superior Council, deliberative body as part of the competence to discuss space initiatives and the governance, and it's linked to Brazilian Space Agency. But one big problem here, the name of the Brazilian Space Agency did not appear in the National Space Council decree. So the law that creates the biggest and more important government space in Brazil, linked to the President Lula, didn't have the name of the Brazilian Space Agency. So how, if you think in the United States, NASA, it's the secretary, I can see that, of the National Space Council. But here we did it the same. So I can think, I can imagine National Space Council without Brazilian Space Agency working with this council. Just demonstrate the minor importance of the agency inside Brazilian institutions and the ministries. Brazilian Space Agency organize your investments using the National Program for Space Activities, PNAE. It is a 10-year planned program. And inside this document, it's possible to visualize the recent version. You can see the recent version in the IB website. And here I will present the vision, the strategy, and the priorities for the next year. And here we have other big problems, in my opinion, because when we look at this document, we can find at least 8 key sectors. We can find a lot of strategic objectives, several projects that could be started if AEB receive an increasing of budget. It's very confused document. But being realistic, for this year, the AEB budget is around $50 million, just $15 million, with possibility of the cut in the next month. So if you do not have priorities well defined, it's impossible to develop projects. Brazil have projects under development in launching, in satellites, launching center applications, and others. But the budget is just $50 million. So it's imperative that AEB decide what really matters, what is the most important for our sector, which segment Brazil should invest. And we need to decide. It's impossible for us to have a launching center, to have a launching vehicle, to have satellites, to invest in applications. Canada is a very good example. Canada decides what is important for the country and invest the money there. So Brazil needs to study, to reflect about what is our main characteristic, what space sector could help in the development of the country, and put this sector, these objectives as priorities. For the military side, we have a strategic program for space system. I bring here the main idea of the program, but I could not find fresh information about the budget. I know they launched 3 satellites, if I'm not wrong, last year's Carponis constellation, I think. But I prefer don't say because I don't have flash information here, but exists a 10-year long-term plan for the defense side in Brazil. Doing a SWOT analysis of the Brazilian space program. We have here strength, opportunities, weakness, and threats. But I would like to talk about one point, right? And this point, it's regulation, legislation in development, because AEB has been working in the regulation of sector since 2021. And the operator license and authorization launching were developed looking at the FAA regulations. So at this time, our idea was to create a standard in terms of rules. So the companies should present the same documents if they are interested to launch from Brazil or US. And this is a positive point to Brazil. And we expect that this idea could be adopted by other countries. So we can international standard for launching regulations. But last week we had a surprise here in Brazil. The Brazilian Space Act was approved by President Lula. And this law has positive aspects. It provides legal security for private investment. It is also a different law from other countries, as it includes elements from both civilian and defense sides, which is not common. I don't remember to see SpaceX bringing in the same law what is defense side, what is civilian side. Normally, the new Space Act just bring the legal security for private activities, but it's okay. It's okay. The main point is that we have legal security now for private activities in Brazil. This law brings many responsibilities to the Brazilian Space Agency, which have to create or upgrade, update its regulations, especially at the time when AB is experience workforce problem. So Brazilian Space Agency today do not have workforce enough to do all these activities. I'm a Brazilian Space Agency employee, but I'm outside Brazilian AB for now. I'm working at the General Attorney's Office, and many of my friends are outside Brazilian Space Agency at this time. And we don't have, we are not expecting the entry of new employees in Brazilian Space Agency, so I'm a little concerned. And I know the size of the problem that the president of Brazilian Space Agency will confront in the next month. But I'm hoping a very good final happy here. Hey. Here. I would like you to look at this this slide, because I bring the Article 7 of the law. So regarding the aspects related to defense, one point that caught attention is this article, because in this article, the Defense Authority can request information and data from companies of this segment of the sensors and monitoring space operations. So my thoughts is how it will impact the market. Will companies accept that acting in Brazil? If is the information was strategic for the companies will allow to share this data with the government. So we need to think about it. It's one of the main points that make me think a lot, and it made me think if it was really necessary to to bring this kind of two distinct bodies in the law. It is really necessary to bring the defense authority in the law. Would you do two different laws, one just to private and commercial activities, and one to discipline, to explain, to regulate the defense activities? Maybe yes, but it is what we can for now. So I will present the results of two papers that are both with my colleagues, and we talk about space industry for now. So this figure shows a clear budget increase between 2008 and 2014, followed by a step decrease afterward. These variations are related to macroeconomic conditions. Brazil is not going so well at this time. And the period between 2008 and 2014 underwent accelerated growth and an increase in income for Brazil. However, since 2015, the country has entered a fiscal crisis for which it has not yet recovered, and we still in a not so good shape. Here we can see that the relative share of space activities in Brazilian budget. After a peak in 2009, its lowest level in the past 2 decades was reached in 2019. In comparison with BRIC countries, Brazil spends considerable less than Russia, China, and India. Yeah, space is not a priority here. I love this figure because this figure shows how the launching centers and Earth observation were by far the most important items for the space budget in Brazil. However, the priorities of the Brazilian space policy changed throughout the years, as the budget data, when we can see here in this slide. And it's a problem when we think in long-term investments. No project is concluded because the priority change every time. Here is the second paper that I wrote, and both papers are available in the internet. If anyone have some problems to get, just send me an email and I will share with pleasure the complete article. The Brazilian space sector is small. It's very government oriented, and here the aerospace activities are part. Here aerospace activities are part of the military activities, which is probably why Brazilian policymakers have not put much effort into developing commercial activities, or why most companies depend heavily on the public sector for survival. Many companies, especially the large ones, do not operate only on space activities. We can think that space sector is an additional source of revenue, but not the main activity of these companies. The companies that are active in other sectors, such as aviation or infrastructure, have migrated to defense and space activities in recent years, due to mergers or new government investments, especially in satellites. Brazil investments in defense as a whole, and in particular space activities, it's very, very, very low. During the 90s up to 2005, we have a lack of clear government incentives that limitate official support in foreign negotiations, high taxes, and strong competition from foreign companies reduce the competitiveness of Brazilian companies engaged in defense and space activities. From 2005 and until now, new investments were made and new regulations were proposed, such as the National Plan for Space Activities, the new edition. But some authors do not believe that they were enough to steer policy into clear directions. And the situation is not getting better. The budget is decreasing year by year, and we not have a clear direction about what is priorities from Brazilian Space Agency. Last year, we had government investments in 3 financing notes, non-refundable resource. The object are the development of satellites and launchers. And it is a positive point, as it was a note aimed directly at the industry without the participation of the prime contractor that in Brazil, it's government institutions like Air Force and INPE. But it is necessary to evaluate how the industry will behave and whether they will be capable of delivering the products requested, because our industry is small. Our industry it's not internationally competitive. So it's we can think these notes it's like a test, or it's a way that government could prepare our company for the international environment. So it's a very important initiative from government. We're using this paper a data that was that we bring from the 2 studies that I coordinate when I was at Brazilian Space Agency. It's 2 catalogs. So you have the Brazilian Space Industry catalog and the Alcântara Space Center suppliers. Because we, at the time, I thought something like that. Foreign companies coming to Brazil, how they will find companies to work together to be supplier. So we need to prepare catalogs. This is the face of our catalogs. They are in Portuguese and English version. So you can find this in the Brazilian Space website. And I'm finished, just 3 slides, please. So we combine the data from these 2 catalogs to generate a few informations easier to see. So as you can see in figure 1, the space companies are concentrated in the southwest of Brazil, which is the industrial area of the country, São José dos Campos, and more specifically in the state of São Paulo. The city of São José dos Campos is an industrial cluster for the space sector and the home of many spin-off companies too. Here we have the distribution of companies and aerospace engineer course. We have 8 courses in Brazil. And we have a concentration in the southwest region, again, but it is possible to notice that the courses are better distributed than industry. São José dos Campos is still the space hub of Brazil, but there is potential for new concentration states in Northwest because Alcântara Space Center is located in the Maranhão, and Barreira do Inferno Launching Center is located at Rio Grande do Norte state. And this table shows that space companies are on average much smaller than non-space companies, because in the catalog, the catalog was made with the companies filling a form. So the catalog is open for any company that have interest to fulfill. So analyzing the catalog, I have companies that are typically space and typically no space. It's a support company. For example, I have companies that can provide telecommunications cable. It's not typically space, but it's a company that can support space activity. So we divide these 2 kinds of companies in our paper. So this table shows that the companies are much smaller than non-space companies. This reinforces the view that apart from a prime contractor, there are several smaller suppliers. So we have two or three big companies like Avibras, for example, in the defense side or launching vehicle side, and we have smaller companies that provide a few equipments for this big company. And for finish here, the good news is that space companies have a more educated workforce. So almost 4% have MA or PhD degree. So it's very, very nice to see. And it's that I would like to talk. Thank you. My email is here. My LinkedIn profile is here. So if you have any questions or want to discuss a little more in the topic, please just send a message.
We would like to thank you, Dr. Michele Mello, for the knowledge provided, and we also invite you to stay with us. Closing the first round of lectures, we would like to invite the PhD candidate Bruno Martini from the postgraduate program in Aerospace Sciences at the Brazilian Air Force University to mediate the discussion with the speakers. Welcome, Mr. Martini.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, we conclude the first half of our International Space Security webinar with a debate among the three previous lecturers with some questions from the audience. I would like to thank you all for your informative and insightful presentations and declare how happy I am to have such bright space policy scientists and analysts sharing part of their knowledge with us today. We opened the lectures today with Professor Peter Hayes from the George Washington University Space Policy Institute. From the old way of warfare, Dr. Hayes brought us an evolution towards the current hybrid wars with an increasing reliance on space systems. He presented us some force enhancement space missions and counter-space capabilities. He concluded calling attention to the threat posed by the potential usage of nuclear weapons at Earth orbital regions. Following, Professor John Klein, also from the George Washington University Space Policy Institute, presented us some of his theories written in 3 essential books regarding defense in the space domain. He gave us a deeper perspective about irregular warfare and how it applies to the current outer space competition. If some armed conflict starts in the space domain or escalate to there, how this present-day space warfare could look like? Which principles and strategies could be applied there? And finally, Dr. Michele Mello from the Brazilian Space Agency, presently serving at the Brazilian Attorney General's office, concluded our first round of lectures presenting the increasing influence from the space commercial sector, the outer space economy, and the space governance, focusing on the Brazilian space program and the Brazilian industrial base relevance for it. She has stressed the difficulties to measure the space economy and has also posed some challenge on the new space definition itself. So I invite those three colleagues to join us for a 30 minutes debate and the opportunity to interact with our audience, which has sent us some questions. So I would like to start asking Dr. Peter Hayes. Doctor, how reliant on space assets are the current space powers, the US, China, Russia, and India? Is any of them more reliant than the other ones? Or do you see a trend towards greater reliance on space data among other military powers as well?
Well, thank you for that question, Bruno. Yes, absolutely. Really, all major military powers are growing increasingly reliant on space. As I tried to highlight in my slides, for the United States, The transition point was back in 1991 with Operation Desert Storm, the operation against Iraq to expel them from Kuwait. And that demonstrated how effective space is in supporting modern military operations. And subsequently, we've seen really just increasing use, particularly by the United States, but over the past decade or so, we've increasingly seen work by the Chinese and the Russians, not only to develop their own space systems, but to develop counter space systems that are designed to take away those US space capabilities. So there's a very definite trend, as you indicated, and it seems to be accelerating in that direction.
Thank you, Doctor. And Dr. John Klein, I would direct to you the next question, please. More than hybrid and irregular warfare, do you believe a conventional armed conflict in outer space is a likely scenario for the near future? Is it more avoidable than regular wars on Earth, or is it just a matter of when?
Thank you for the question, Bruno. Unlike being a typical academic, I'm going to give you a straightforward answer on this one. So I'm an optimist. I say in the near term, what you would consider conventional, regular styles of warfare in space is not going to occur. I'll caveat that. So that would be like countries launching direct descent, hit to kill, anti-satellite missiles at each other, lasers destroying their exquisite systems, potentially space to Earth effects. So that's the opposite of irregular warfare. That's what we consider regular warfare. I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. I think what is happening now and what will probably continue in the future is this coercion, these activities that aren't, it's not peace. Jamming and lasing is going on all the time. Coercive rendezvous and proximity operations are going on. We have GPS jamming. We have cyber attacks. So cyber domains and space domains intersect. So at times cyber warfare can be space warfare. We saw that in the lead up to Russia's invasion when the company Viasat had its attack. So it's kind of intertwined on that. Also, it's not space warfare necessarily, it's just war. So, we can't really expect, let's say, hopefully great powers have a conflict. We may see it start or extend into space, but conflicts, Clausewitz teaches the serving the aims of policy and political aims. Wars have a political context, and right now that political context is on the Earth, geopolitically, economic competition and the like. So I don't think we can say, hey, we're going to have a big war in space and nothing on Earth. I think there'll be kind of a synergy or some type of interdependence between the two.
Thank you, Doctor. And please, Dr. Michel Mello, I would ask you to weigh a little more something you have already pointed out on your presentation, but regarding the Brazilian space program, how do you see the current shift in focus from a satellite launch vehicle, the so-called VLS, to a microsatellite launch vehicle, which we call VLM? Do you agree with this shift? Could you stress a little more about it?
Yes. No, good question. The market is changing for nanosats. So we need to think if VLM is an obsolete project. So we need to think about VLN, nanosats vehicle launcher. But in this scenario, we have a major question here, because today the development of the VLM is paid by Brazilian Space Agency. So tricky question here is the VLM commercially viable? I think not. I don't have all the information, all the calculations, but I think not. So we have a new market with small costs, higher competition. So I think that VLM in the project as today, they don't have participation in this market. But we think, okay, it's not a commercial question. It's a national security question. We need to invest because space, access to space is strategic for the nation. Okay, I understand that. I agree with you. But in this case, Air Force should pay for the development because Brazilian Space Agency is a civilian institution. So we need to promote, we need to stimulate the market. We need to provide companies the instruments that to development, new products, new service, and be competitive in the international markets. So we doing that, we doing the development of the country, the technological and innovation development of the country. But like I said before, AB, Brazilian Space Agency should define what is priority, what is important, and it's that.
Thank you, Doctor. I really appreciate it. Well, the next question is posed to all the speakers, so you are all available to answer it. It is, what about national borders, state power, and sovereignty in space? Is it a reproduction of what we see on Earth, or does space present other and new questions? Anyone would like to give us an answer?
I'll start off. I mean, I'll just go to the Outer Space Treaty. There are no claims of sovereignty in space or on celestial bodies. The spacecraft and satellites are considered sovereign to the states that launch them per the Launch Convention and the like. So it's a different construct than what we really see. But that's, again, where we bring in the analogy of the maritime domain. International waters aren't claims of sovereignty either. It's a shared domain. The importance of that is because space is shared between all states, and I would say also commercial companies, which are considered third parties. You know, these enduring issues such as debris and space sustainability are important because just like you've seen these plastic islands in the Pacific, collectively, the human population can pollute a domain where it's really not usable to some extent. We can do the same thing in space. So no claims of sovereignty. You do potentially have safety zones on the moon per the Artemis Accords, but that's different than claims of sovereign territory.
To give the opportunity to other members of the audience who sent us new questions, I would like to ask you another question to you, please, Dr. Mello. What questions does the space raise in terms of ethics and especially bioethics?
Wow. I think this is a new area, so I'm not confident to answer correctly this question for now, but the new developments in the space sector with the space tourism, with the deep space exploration, will bring us new questions. So what will happen if I kill anyone in space? What is going on when I explore celestial bodies? What is wrong? What is right? So I feel that our friends from another knowledge areas will help us to answer that better than me at this moment. But I would say a little about the question you said before, because I was watching UNOSA event last year, and we saw, I was talking about the slogan of the event, Spaces for All. And when we read the Outer Space Treaty, it's correct. It's correct because space is for all humankind, and the benefits should be distributed for all cultures. But when we think about the rise of the private companies, of the private sector, it's really hard to think that space is for all. Because I'm seeing Brazil trying, I'm seeing US trying, China, India, Japan, Europe. But when we think about the African countries, they have not access to space. They have not access to benefits from the space. So I think the one ethical question should be that how are we equalizing these benefits? Because our friend here, so the space is for all. Space should be for all. So it's a few questions that makes me thinking instead of sleeping.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Well, since our time is up for this debate and half an hour has already passed, I would suggest we move on. And I would like to thank you all, especially our Space Policy Fellows, Dr. Michelle Bello, Dr. Peter Hayes, Dr. John Klein, and certainly all the audience which stays with us. We will have now a short break. Could you inform us a little more about it, please, Sergeant Marcella? Thank you.
Now we'll have a 10-minute break, and right after that, we are coming back for the second round of lectures at 10:05 a.m.
Thank you.
Now beginning the second round of lectures, we would like to invite Colonel Eduardo Vale, Professor of the Postgraduate Program in Aerospace Sciences at the Brazilian Air Force University, with the following theme: Outer Space from the Perspective of Cooperation, Development, and Peace. Welcome, Colonel.
Thank you. Are you all seeing the presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good morning. I'm retired Colonel Vale Rosa from Brazilian Air Force Air University, also a professor in this institution. I would like to thank our university's Center for Strategic Studies for inviting me to take part in the international webinar on space security. Space security has attracted the attention of the media, some think tanks, and experts in reports and documents focusing on the potential for conflict in outer space. This is a worrying prospect and deserves our attention. But what is this perspective? Perhaps the best way to characterize it is to look for three words that have defined contemporary space activity. First, the word congested. This refers to the eventual occupation of Earth orbits in such a way that the accumulation of space assets transform this geographical space into one where there is no room for everyone. In line with this vision, the issue of space debris has emerged. Increasingly and apparently uncontrollably, the generation of space debris because of human activity, from rocket parts that break off to debris resulting from explosive detonations in space, would transform Earth orbits, especially low orbits, into a geographical space no longer habitable by satellites and other space systems. The other characterization of the perspective that has been postulated is the word competitive. Part of this problem is associated with the concept of new space, where the growing participation of private companies in space exploration is bringing commercial competition factors to the space market that are different from those previously observed. This is an expansion of the traditional space activity of the public and government sector, state-owned by nature, which characterized the Cold War space race, to a new profile of the activity, which has been called the second space race, where new state actors, very well characterized by the great space power, such as the USA, Russia, India, or China, but also by actors with a smaller dimension and influence on the space scene, states that seek to develop more significant space capabilities, as in the case with Brazil. Finally, the word contested, whose meaning is associated with realist theories of international relations and with the very nature of classical geopolitics. The idea around this concept is clearly directed towards the issue of space security, specifically in what has been called counter-space capabilities. According to some reports by non-governmental organizations and researchers who work with open sources, the main space powers and some aspiring states are developing weapons for a war in space. These include anti-satellite weapons that destroy space systems in orbit, weapons that carry out proximity operations on satellites, or directed energy weapons, as well as electronic and cyber interference weapons, which seem to be the two best developed capabilities. Despite the strong tendency to explore outer space based on these premises of congested, competitive, and contested space, our presentation explores arguments that diverge from this approach. We don't want to transform realities that are, to a greater or lesser extent, present in contemporary times. Our point of view is to offer a vision that will be based on different premises and center the discussion on the subtitle of the webinar, which is the perception of outer space as a geopolitical space for a sustainable future for our societies. This is how we propose very briefly an appreciation of outer space from a perspective that focuses on cooperation, socio-economic development, and the peaceful progress of humanity, precisely to establish a counterpoint to the words we discussed earlier. To the viewer of this presentation, it may seem that seeing outer space from this less confrontational perspective would be an idealistic, unrealistic, or even utopian vision. Perhaps it is, but if we don't dare to deal with geographical space from an integrated, collaborative, and developmental perspective, we will be denying the very essence of humanity. The word cooperation can replace the word competition. Cooperation can be studied from 2 points of view: cooperation between states and cooperation between the public and private sectors. International state cooperation is at the root of the space race itself. Even in the early years of the Cold Wars, initiatives such as President Eisenhower's in favor of a favorable environment for cooperation with the Soviet Union were evident, however improbable they may have seemed, especially in the direction of an international legislation. The joint Apollo's mission in 1975 expressed this possibility when an American and a Soviet spacecraft met in space, symbolizing a milestone of space cooperation at a time of global tension. It should be recognized that even in troubled periods of history, attempts at international cooperation have been on the agenda of states. From the point of view of complexity, both political and technological, the International Space Station is perhaps the most enduring example of this type of initiative. The ISS is a global effort involving 15 nations, including the USA and Russia, in a venture in low Earth orbit that has hosted 18 astronauts, including a Brazilian, since 1998, conducting scientific experiments of general interest. The sense of sharing technologies, pooling efforts, distributing knowledges and skills from different countries makes it possible to maximize results and minimize costs. Important in the field of international state cooperation is the sharing of space situational awareness, known as SSA. The Convention of the Registration of Objects Launched into Space, which came into effect in 1974, is an international cooperation mechanism relating to SSA, whose main purpose is to provide states with a means of helping to identify space objects. In addition to this initiative, some states share information from their satellite sensors, allowing for satellite collision prevention, international collaboration in space traffic management, and essential information to avoid space debris, which can cause serious damage to space systems. Another collaborative initiative worth highlighting is NASA's Artemis program, something that Russia and China also seem to be offering as a possibility in the case of the International Lunar Research Station. According to NASA, the program aims to restart the exploration of the moon for scientific purposes, including the prospect of permanently inhabited structures on this celestial body. The program includes a series of international agreements, and so far, 39 countries have signed up to these agreements, including Brazil, committing themselves to establishing a peaceful and prosperous future in space. In addition to state cooperation, the scope of Artemis includes strong partnerships between the public sector and private companies. This is exactly the point that leads to the second form of cooperation we would like to emphasize. Collaboration between the public and private sectors plays a crucial role in space exploration. Governments and space agencies such as NASA and the European Space Agency provide the initial funding and infrastructure needed for research and development, while private companies such as SpaceX and Blue Origin bring innovation, efficiency, and new technologies to the field. This public-private partnership model allows space projects to move forward faster and more cost-effectively. For example, SpaceX has managed to significantly reduce rocket launch costs through its reuse technology, something that would be difficult to achieve with public funding alone. In Brazil, there is a major effort to make space sector viable through this type of partnership. In the case of the Alcântara Space Center, this type of cooperation was first implemented. A rocket from Korean company Innospace was launched from there after a public-private agreement was signed to make the operation viable. There are many advantages to cooperation. It promotes peace and understanding between peoples. Using space as a platform to peaceful collaboration and global scientific development, the synergy provided by international and public-private cooperation can further enhance the benefits of space exploration. Joint efforts can inspire future generations of scientists, engineers, and leaders to continue expanding the frontiers of human knowledge. Space explorations plays a significant role in global socio-economic development, impacting both developed and developing countries. In countries that are space powers, the space industry is a crucial source of technological innovation and scientific advancement. Space programs drive the research and development of new technologies that often find practical applications in everyday life, such as communication satellites, GPS-like navigation systems, and environmental monitoring technologies. These advances not only improve quality of life, but also create new markets and job opportunities, strengthening the economy and maintaining the global endeavor of space exploration. Space exploration can be a transformative tool for socio-economic growth. Although some countries may not have the resource to lead space missions, they can benefit significantly from technology and data generated by international space programs. For example, Earth observation satellites can provide vital information for agriculture, natural resource management, natural disaster monitoring, and urban planning. For these reasons, it is urgent to consider the issue that the word congested brings to characterize outer space. This adjective implies considering two perspectives: the space occupied by the scarcity of orbital slots and the space polluted by debris of human origin. From the point of view of occupied space, from 1960s to the present day, there has been an exponential growth of assets in space, of nations owning space systems, and of rockets launched into space. This strategic dynamic leads us to a very simple element that can characterize this issue. Today, around 70% of satellites in orbit come from the United States. But there is one fact we would like to highlight as an example: the appropriation of geostationary orbits that house important telecommunication satellites. These are finite geographical spaces, limited spaces, despite the immensity of the cosmos. It is estimated that there are around 1,800 thousand orbital slots for satellites to be placed in these orbits, and that according to 2023 data, there are already around 600 satellites occupying these orbits. As we see it, the idea that space should be distributed equally, safeguarding the principle of Hess communities, rather than what seems to prevail, which is the principle of ut possidetis, according to which those who occupy a territory have the right to it. This problem is compounded by addition of strategic factor, which is regulated by the ITU, In the case of the allocation of frequencies for geostationary satellites, the ITU recognizes in Article 44 of its constitution that this is a scarce resource and that this distribution must be based on principles of equitable access and non-digital exclusion, as is the case with the reservation of frequencies for developing countries. These issues are vital for socioeconomic development, especially for those states with less potential in space exploration. Facilitating access to space technologies and resources can lead to the emergence of local technology industries, diversifying the economy and creating skilled jobs. Space exploration is an activity that drives technological innovation, empowers the economy, and provides indispensable tools for progress and improving quality of life. Historically, geopolitical theories tell us that technology has had the effect of changing the meaning of certain spatial relationships. Technology refers to a body of knowledge concerning the means and methods of producing something, increasingly dependent on science. Space technology has the potential to make the world more peaceful, precisely by opposing the word contested, allowing for better social interactions that bring civilizations close together rather than distancing them. Today, we can no longer think of life in society without the devices and tools that enable global connections. The service that allow populations to integrate and the countless applications that we use every day on our electronic devices. The technology of satellite systems contributes for decisive impacts of some geopolitical aspect, the focus of which should be peaceful. Firstly, in our capacity for spatial perception, remote sensing with satellites has led us to rethinking mapping activities with greater detail in observation, with a truly global view of the planet and part of the cosmos, with the possibility of surveying images in real time. Paradoxically, even though they were aimed at exploring outer space, satellites and spacecraft gave humanity a greater boost in knowledge by looking more clearly and directly at the Earth, rather than vaguely at other similar planets. In this sense, we became aware of how small we are in relation to the universe. Secondly, on the issue of location, technology changed the sense of proximity. Telecommunications make it possible to share information via satellites, which drives social and political change, among other things, but also because of the sense of geographical positioning, perception of surroundings, and global interaction through apps. We are closer, regardless of our beliefs, race, or religions. Space technology has made us perceive each other as neighbors, regardless of distance. When it comes to the character of places and the people who live there, technology allows for the comparisons and influence on ways of life. Technologies that use intercommunication provided by satellites direct our behavior, such as social media, messaging applications, booking tickets or hotels, and even those that favor personal relationships. The fact is that these applications and associated technologies play a fundamental role in society, capable of affecting our personal lives, political systems, and stimulating change of great geopolitical relevance. All this technology makes us more equal, much closer, and increasingly aware of other people's realities. The crucial meaning of space technology inspires humanity to look beyond its terrestrial difference and pursue common goals of greatness and exploration. When human beings investigate the cosmos and contemplate the vastness of the universe, they often feel united by a sense of shared wonder and humility. This feeling of cosmic connection can, in turn, influence international relations, encouraging nations to resolve their differences peacefully and cooperatively. Well, as conclusion to this brief presentation, we can say the following. Outer space has largely been characterized by aspects related to a congested, competitive, and contested environment. From our perspective, aligning ideas with the purpose of building a sustainable future for this frontier of humanity, we offer some counterpoints to this characterization. In short, we seek to lend outer space a different stereotype, based on ideas of international cooperation, including public and private cooperation, socioeconomic development, and peaceful progress for humanity. With that, we end our presentation by thanking you for the opportunity and adapting the phrase of a leading American astronaut. The conquest of space is a small step in the history of mankind, but a giant leap for peace, development, and cooperation among mankind. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
We would like to thank you, Colonel Eduardo Vale, for the knowledge provided, and we also invite you to stay with us. Now we will have the fifth talk, which will be led by the Chief Director, Space Security and Stability of the Secure World Foundation, Ms. Victoria Sampson, who will address the following topic, counter-space capabilities and how to mitigate them. Welcome, Ms. Sampson.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, UNIFA, for asking me to speak amongst these great speakers. I've learned a lot this morning so far, and I look forward to the conversation with everyone today. So my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. As was said, today I'll be going into counter-space capabilities and various diplomatic efforts to try and mitigate the threats posed by them. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about my organization, if you're unfamiliar with the Secure World Foundation. We're a US-based nonprofit organization that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So our vision is a secure, sustainable, and peaceful use of outer space. Again, looking at how it helps life on this planet, particularly in regards to global stability. And our mission is to work with all stakeholders, government, private sector, international organizations, civil society, to develop and promote these ideas that, again, focus on achieving the secure, sustainable, and peaceful uses of outer space. Next slide, please. So a lot of what I'll be discussing today comes from an annual report that my organization puts together. I'm the co-editor of it. It's our Global Counter Space Capabilities and Open Source Assessment. It's available on our website at the URL on the slide. I will point out that we have the executive summary translated into all 6 official UN languages, and this year we're happy to also have it translated into Japanese and Portuguese. So if you're interested, that might be a place to check out further information. But it's just kind of a big picture, sort of a discussion about it. While the existence of counter space capabilities is not new, the circumstances surrounding them are. We've had a lot of discussion today about how space is inherently interwoven into daily lives for everyone, as well as a key national security enabler for many countries, and it affects global stability on this planet. And so, as more countries get in further space capabilities, and as more countries become dependent upon space for their economies, for their security, that sort of thing, there's more and more of incentive for other countries to interrupt, interfere, deny, degrade, somehow keep them from getting that benefit from space. And so we're seeing a proliferation of counter space capabilities right now. Kind of a big picture sort of discussion. If you don't want to read the 300-page document, I will point out that there's a significant amount of research and development on a wide range of both destructive and non-destructive counter space capabilities by quite a few countries. However, when we're looking at current military operations, we only see non-destructive capabilities being actively used at this point. Next slide, please. So there's many different ways in which you can talk about counter space capabilities. Different organizations have different ways of slotting them. We look at 5 different capabilities. We look at direct ascent capabilities, that is to say weapons that are launched from somewhere on Earth to directly impact a satellite in space. They're not placed in orbit themselves, as opposed to co-orbital weapons, which are weapons that are placed in orbit and then maneuver to do whatever they're going to be doing, whether that is to kinetically impact, to jam, to collect intelligence, whatever it is on the assets it's targeting. Then we look at directed energy, the idea you're looking at focused energy such as lasers, particle beams that will somehow interfere or destroy the space systems. If you heard of news stories a few months ago about Russia possibly developing a nuclear warhead that would be placed in orbit and anti-satellite capacity, the electromagnetic pulse, the EMP that would be created from a nuclear warhead would be a type of directed energy weapon. As well, we looked at electronic warfare, the idea of just jamming to interfere or somehow affect or spoof communications to or from satellites. And then cyber capabilities, whether that's against ground stations or the satellite themselves or the end users. As well, we look at space situational awareness. And I know that's not a counter space capability. There are many reasons why you would want to be able to track objects on orbit. Many that are peaceful in nature or at least non-military in nature. However, if you are going to be targeting other actors' satellites or space capabilities, you will need an SSA capability. So that's why we include this in our assessment. Next slide, please. So this is what we call our stoplight chart. And I saw Dr. Hayes used other national versions of that in his presentation. This is kind of all the countries we look at here. And so a couple things about this chart, just kind of a big picture sort of assessment. The legend says the green circles mean that as far as we can tell, there are no capabilities being developed by that country of that particular kind. The yellow square means some, and the red triangle means significant. Now, these are just assessments by me and my fellow co-editor. It's not really a hugely scientific assessment. Every year we sit down and we think, well, should this be a yellow square or a red triangle? So, take it with a grain of salt. But I think it's helpful for kind of a big picture sort of look about these different capabilities. I will point out the y-axis looks at co-orbital capabilities, whether they're low Earth orbit or medium and geostationary orbit. Then we look at direct ascent capabilities, again, dividing them up between low Earth orbit and then further out. We look at directed energy, electronic warfare, and then finally space situational awareness. I will point out the x-axis. If you're looking at these countries, you may notice that these are not listed in alphabetical order, and that's done deliberately. The way we organize our global counterspace threat assessment is that we divide it up between countries that have conducted destructive anti-satellite tests and then those who have not. And for the countries that have conducted destructive anti-satellite tests, we do them in the chronological order of which those countries conducted them. So the first country is the United States, 1959, held its first anti-satellite tests. And then we have Russia/Soviet Union, 1963. China, first one that created debris, 2007. First one they attempted was 2005. And then India, 2019. And then the rest of the countries you can see are done alphabetically. I will point out we have 12 countries this year. When we first started this assessment in 2018, we had 6 countries. And so you can see we've doubled the amount of countries in about 6 years. And there's always a few countries we're keeping an eye on to see like, hey, is this their year? For example, this year we added Israel partially because of all the jamming that's been happening in regards to its attack on Gaza, but also they conducted they conducted a missile defense test that was exo-atmospheric. So we decided this year was the time to include them. But kind of big picture. So if you look, pretty much everyone has some sort of space situation awareness capability. Pretty much everyone does some sort of radio frequency interference, whether it's spoofing or jamming or that sort of thing. But I mean, if you look at the more, I would say, possibility for destructive capabilities, whether that's directed energy, direct descent, co-orbital, you see it dropping off. It's really just, the United States, Russia, China, lesser extent India, that are really focusing on this sort of capabilities. And I could probably spend the whole time discussing this chart, but happy to answer questions about it during the Q&A. Next slide, please. One of the things that we include, just to give you a sense of the, I guess, frequency or the urgency of these anti-satellite tests, we have this table that looks at anti-satellite tests by year. And it starts off again 1959 and then most recent 2023. So looking at it, again, if you can't see very well, the United States is represented by blue, Russia/Soviet Union, red, excuse me, China, yellow, orange, whatever you want to call it, and then India, green. And so you can see in the beginning of the space age, there's a lot of blue, a lot of red. It was the United States and then Soviet Union that was conducting those anti-satellite tests. And really a lot in the first decade, I would argue, of the space age. And then you see it kind of dropping off as you get further out. And then once the Soviet Union fell, and there's a decade really where there were no anti-satellite tests being held. And then it picks up again in 2005, and you see a new country started then, China jumped in then, and then you see the cadence picking up as India did in 2019. And so again, this is just helpful to get a sense of where we are to contextualize these discussions. I think sometimes, often in the United States, it's portrayed as space is peaceful, and then other countries start doing tests, and so we have to catch up. And clearly, that's not the case. But I also think it's helpful to point, we are at a point where things are changing and things are more, I guess, military activities are happening, and you're seeing more counter space capabilities being actively tested. And so this is an issue to be concerned about. Next slide, please. I apologize. This is something of an eye chart, but this is table 5.1 from Secure World's Global Counterspace Threat Assessment. It's available on our homepage for that and also in the document itself. But I like this table because it looks at the amount of debris created by anti-satellite tests in space and really to emphasize why it's concerned. So what we did is we had all the tests that we know of that created debris during an anti-satellite capacity test. And then we see, okay, here's the country that did it. Here's as much as we know about the test itself. Here's the amount of tracked debris that was created, and that's an important distinction because there's debris that's easy to detect, that's trackable, and then there's debris that's too small to detect, that's untrackable, but could be very easily be dangerous to other actors in space. And so we see, okay, how much of the trackable debris is created, and how much of that debris is still in orbit, and how long has that been? So you can see we've got some debris from tests over 50 years ago that's still in orbit. And then we have debris, really the biggest impact debris was in 2007 when China held their anti-satellite tests at a fairly high orbit, all things considering for anti-satellite tests, 880 kilometers, and created over 3,000 pieces of tracked debris, of which you have 2,600 that are still around. And then looking at the most recent test that created debris that we know about was Russia's test in November 2021, which created over 1,800 pieces of trackable debris, of which over 60 are still around. And so you can see of the tests that have been held since the beginning of the space age, there have been over 6,800 pieces of trackable debris created, of which 3,100 are still around. And this is important because, again, the debris that's created in these tests endangers all actors, all users of space data. Next slide, please. This is available on our website. This is an infographic we did on debris created from anti-satellite tests. Again, I understand this is hard to read, but what I like is this shows the point of impact, and it shows how far out the debris gets thrown out from these tests. So again, sometimes for a while, there's a narrative going around that you could have a responsible anti-satellite test if you just had it at a low enough altitude and you pointed the interceptor down, everything would just fall down very easily. And that's not the case. I mean, these explosions are, they're kinetic and they shoot debris everywhere. And so you can see there are times where the impact was at, maybe 400 kilometers and it goes out to 2,000, and debris from that test goes out to 2,000 kilometers. And to grossly simplify, the higher up the debris is, the higher up the altitude, the longer it takes to come back down. and the more time it has to endanger other actors. So again, it's just kind of, I think, a helpful visualization of the threat that debris creates from these anti-satellite tests. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about the threat and the concern of counter space capabilities. I'm going to shift gears now to talk a little bit about, well, what are we doing about this? And going into multilateral security discussions about this. For many years, there's been no movement, I would argue, whatsoever at the United Nations on these issues. And this kind of stems from a disagreement amongst the major space powers in terms of what the threat is and how to deal with it. So there are countries, Russia, China, that really focus on the idea there are specific weapons that are placed in space, designated weapons, and they're going to threaten targets largely on the ground. And so what they propose is a treaty, the Treaty on the Prevention of Placing Weapons in Outer Space, the threat of use of force against outer space objects, known as a PPWT. And that was proposed in 2008 and revised in 2014. And basically has not gone anywhere, but still keeps getting brought up over and over again as an option. Versus the United States and its allies and partners have focused on almost, as Dr. Villarosa was talking about, congestion. It's almost environmental, and so you have to worry about activities and actions. But there really weren't any counter proposals. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the discussions. I have this here more for research purposes, but I'll point out it was almost like a hamster wheel, just going round and round circles, same thing over again, treaty, no treaty, weapons versus nothing, until about 4 years ago, when the UK sponsored a resolution, UN General Assembly 75/36, where they call for countries to start looking at behavior, and they ask countries to give reports to the UN Secretary General about, okay, what do you see as responsible versus irresponsible behavior, and how should we handle it? And so reading through those reports, about 30 of them that came in, a Secure World as civil society submitted a report as well, you can see some commonalities emerge. The idea that it's irresponsible to deliberately create debris in orbit. It's irresponsible to deliberately interfere with other activities. Trying to do non-consensual close approaches, that sort of thing. So with that, they a year later, there was a creation of a UN General Assembly resolution that created there's something called the UN Open-Ended Working Group. The idea that they look at norms, rules, and principles, behavior, and threats of use of force. Next slide, please. So this met for 2 years, 4 times, and over 70 countries participated, including civil society. Secure World was an observer and was asked to provide expert commentary to the group several times during that time. So obviously we're biased, but I think it was really interesting. It did not come to consensus, which we could have a whole discussion about that. But again, I think it was very helpful in a couple different ways. One of which we saw many countries understand that it's not norms of behavior or a legally binding treaty. You can have both approaches. In fact, one often leads to the other. And I think that may have moved the dial a little bit in terms of discussions about how the UN should approach these sort of things. You see, again, convergence on several issue areas. Again, the idea of avoiding deliberate duration of debris, the need for rules of actions in terms of notifications, consultations, that sort of thing. And then finally, there's the importance of transparency and confidence building measures. So I'll go into a little bit more about General Assembly /7741, but it calls for countries to make the commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite tests. Pretty widely supported. 155 countries supported it. Brazil was a co-sponsor of that resolution. And then going back to the idea of no first placement of weapons in outer space, that was supported, sponsored by Russia. Also passed, and that's something that they've been doing for some time. We track multilateral space initiatives on our website, and so we've actually got a spreadsheet where we say, okay, here are all the resolutions, and here's who co-sponsored them, and here's how they voted. And you can see that this has been something that we've just been pushing for some time. And then just right now where we are is that there's currently a group of governmental experts ongoing right now to discuss legally binding approaches to threats to space, and that's focusing more on the PPWT aspect. So they're actually meeting, I think, this week in Geneva to finish up discussions, and then we may go back again to open-ended working group to pick up the conversation that started before. So again, not to go into the deep dive in UN machinery, but just there are processes happening, and while it's slow, I think that's a characteristic, not a fault, and that's how you build consensus in terms of these sort of things. Next slide, please. So, and there are a couple of different tools for improving communication and transparency that help with these, threats to counter space to space capabilities. Secure World was involved in both of these. One of them is a lexicon for outer space security. And dealing of watching these multilateral space security discussions, it became very clear that oftentimes countries were coming to these discussions just with different understandings of what key terms meant. And so what we wanted to do is say, okay, what do we all understand these acronyms to mean, and what do we understand for these definitions, and then where do we see different viewpoints? And so that's available on UNITA's website in all 6 UN languages. And so it's meant, we're going to keep continuing that conversation. It's meant just to help elucidate things. And then as well, we have created a space security portal. So it's an interactive map of just kind of identifying what countries have done in terms of space security initiatives. And if you click on it, you can see, how they voted on UN resolutions. Do they have a space agency? Do they have a space strategy? And for example, Brazil's on there, and you can click through. And I was just listening to Dr. Mele's discussion about the Space Act that was passed a week or so back, and I'm like, okay, we got to update the portal. But I think it should be helpful. Again, these are transparency and confidence building measures to share information, just to get a sense of what countries are thinking, so you can contextualize actions, behaviors, and statements within that discussion. Next slide, please. So going into a destructive direct-to-send anti-satellite missile test moratorium, that's a unilateral effort that is increasingly being multilateralized. So in April 2022, the United States announced it's making a commitment not to conduct destructive direct-to-send anti-satellite missile tests, and that language was done very specific. Again, largely because of the debris that's created that affects all actors in space. It's since been joined by 36 more countries. So 37 countries in total have made this commitment. And I know from what I understand, the United States is pushing for more countries to continue to make this commitment. As I said, it was driven partially by the recent Russian DAA-SAT tests. That one has created, as I pointed out in my table a few graphs ago, it's created direct-to-send anti-satellite tests have created the largest contributions to space debris over decades. As I said, this UN General Assembly Resolution 7741 supported this moratorium, basically said, yes, we like it. We'd like to see more countries do it. And again, Brazil was co-sponsor. And this idea of deliberately creating debris in space being considered irresponsible is showing up and over again in various multilateral discussions, including the open-ended working group that I mentioned. And part of the reason is because it's threatening, but also direct-to-send anti-satellite tests are just unhelpful. DAA-SATs are not useful military weapons in a proliferated landscape. Taking out one satellite is probably not going to do much in terms of interfering with your rival country's ability to utilize space, but it's extremely escalatory. You have no plausible deniability like you do for cyber attacks or even jamming. It's irreversible. And it clutters the space environment, and that's an environment that you yourself are trying to operate in. And so it's not really a helpful weapon. And so I think that's part of the reason why countries have said, okay, we actually support this moratorium. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? As I said, it raises a lot of uncertainty in terms of operating in space. It's in terms of the debris that's created, we don't have a way right now to take it back down or to get rid of it. There are a lot of actors working on active debris removal, but no one is saying we're going to be able to get rid of 30,000 pieces of debris from an ASAT test. Like, this is something that's going to be a threat for many years to come. And then again, debris is agnostic in terms of who it approaches. It doesn't matter if your ally was the one that created the debris. If you were operating in space, you're going to have issues with it. And we see this in terms of the Russian test from a few years ago. It created what was called conjunction squalls, and then it had so many close approaches, tens of thousands of close approaches over the course of weeks, that it was very threatening to basically all satellites in sun-synchronous low Earth orbit. Had a lot of close approaches with Starlink satellites, and Starlink has thousands of satellites up there, so you can imagine that was a real challenge. And so this moratorium matters just in terms of how do you build consensus on these issues? How do you make sure the international community understands that this is a threat and irresponsible, as you have more and more countries undertake this moratorium, supporting these discussions and supporting this in multilateral discussions, that sort of thing. And so along those lines, Secure World Foundation organization, we coordinated an industry statement and supported this missile test moratorium with the idea that actors, again, typically not anxious to have official viewpoints on security issues, but they understand like this is threatening to their bottom line. It's threatening to how they use space. It's threatening the environment that they've spent a lot of money to work on. And so we said, okay, are you interested? And so we have currently 49 signatories for 14 countries, and I have a link there for more information. No Brazilian signatories, but I'm always hopeful, and we're always anxious to have more. And then again, this is important just because every person on this planet is a user of space data in some way, shape, or form. And so there's a reason why space security is important. There's a reason why space stability is important. Whether you are a major space power, whether you are an emerging space power, whether you have no space capabilities whatsoever. And so that's really why we promoted this. Next slide, please. And this just gives you a sense of the companies that have made this, that signed this industry statement in support of the commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests. Next slide, please. And I think that might be it for me. Yes, that's the end of my slide. So again, thank you for your attention and your time, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
We would like to thank you, Ms. Sampson, for the knowledge provided. Closing this round of lectures, we would like to invite Mr. Bruno Martini to mediate the discussion with the speakers. Welcome, Mr. Martini.
Thank you. Well, after those two great presentations from Coronel Carlos Eduardo Valli-Rosa and Ms. Victoria Sampson, we are ready to propose a second round of 30 minutes debate. First, Coronel Valli has shared with us some insightful opportunities perceived through the international relations and the geopolitics lens, highlighting the now famous 3 Cs used to describe the current space domain: congested, competitive, and contested, and stimulating a perspective focused on 3 alternative words: cooperation, development, and peace. Later, we had Victoria Sampson presenting us an assessment about the existing and under development counter-space capabilities worldwide and how to mitigate them through international discussions, seeking some consensus pro the space sustainability, and through voluntarily national pledges and multilateral agreements in the name of a responsible behavior in space. So I thank you all, and I would like to present you some questions from our audience. So first, Dr. Valli-Rosa, I would like to ask you, what other concrete steps could Brazil take to enhance its international cooperation in the peaceful uses of space?
Thank you very much, Bruno. I think we first must improve, accelerate the speed of our space program. So there will be other opportunities, other enterprise to deal with the international cooperation. Regarding the recent space law, Brazilian space law, I think it's a very good instrument of policy to increase the participation of the aerospace industry in this enterprise, and probably focusing on the kind of accords like the Artemis. I think this is a very good way to increase our international participation in the space activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Sampson, I would like to direct to you another question. You have showed us how since the first report on counter space capabilities, the number has doubled of countries which possess these specific capabilities. So do you expect a considerable increase in the number of non-state organizations with counter space capabilities in the near future?
Thank you, Bruno. Yeah, I think there will be a continued proliferation of counter space capabilities, partially because many countries are recognizing that space is a national security enabler and it's important to their how they function as a society. And then again, their rivals are understanding more and more that there are things you can do to interfere with those space capabilities. One of the things we look at when we determine, okay, should we be adding a new country to our global counter space threat assessment is, okay, are they creating a military space organization? And for a lot of countries, they have, and they're talking about it. We're seeing more and more statements by countries talking about, okay, well, we need to make sure we have assured access to space. And the way they look at it largely is, okay, we need to have a counter space capability to threaten other countries. And so we're seeing more and more countries not just creating military space organizations, but making statements about the need to be able to develop those capabilities, about the need to, focus on that. Usually it starts with space situational awareness, which again, there's non-military reasons why you would develop SSA capabilities. And as I said, pretty much everyone jams, radio frequency interference is not unusual. So that's kind of a gimme. But in terms of developing the more kinetic and the more destructive stuff, that's where we're starting to see more countries are saying they go from developing a military space organization to making statements and then possibly, doing funding into research and development on these sort of capabilities. And the concern, of course, understanding that there's a reason why you need to protect national security assets. So not criticizing that, but oftentimes it becomes a situation where you're creating the actual threat that you wanted to avoid. As more countries put more money into counter space capabilities, the rivals say, okay, we need to develop the same thing. And so it becomes, kind of a reinforcing mechanism. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I've just mentioned the security dilemma. Sorry.
Exactly. I forgot I'm talking to a bunch of theorists. So yes, absolutely. That's a very good example of that. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And again, I understand, there's no security need for that, but oftentimes when you're making these investments and statements, it's ending up the opposite way in which you wanted to have it happen. So that's why part of the reason why we started this counter space threat assessment is that space gets classified very quickly. And it's hard to have an open source, unclassified, I don't have a clearance discussion of these sort of capabilities. And oftentimes it becomes hyperbolic in terms of how, you see media discussing these sort of things. And that was the impetus for why Secure World started this global counter space threat assessment. We would see news stories in the US media talking about things China and Russia were doing, and it'd just be their, end of the world sort of things. Or if only you knew what the threat is, you want to do more on that. And so we said, okay, what do we actually know about these threats, and how can we, what does it compare to what, the United States and its allies and partners do? And, how do you contextualize it? Because truly you cannot make good policy without having good input. And so our hope is having these open, transparent conversations about the state of, counter space capabilities around the world that may help policymakers make more informed decisions about where they want to go to protect their security assets, but also protect the security and stability of the space environment for all. Thanks.
Thank you. And I would like to pose another question from the audience to both of you. We have seen some developments, mostly theoretical, but some experimental as well, on collecting spacecrafts adapted to collect space junk. And how do both of you see those initiatives of companies creating spacecrafts, specifically designed to collect space junk, keeping in mind that this kind of technology could also be used as a co-orbital counter space capability? Anyone would like to start?
I'm happy to start. And I'd love to hear what my fellow panelists has to say on this as well. Yeah, I think definitely that's something to keep an eye on. Oftentimes you hear people say, well, any satellite can be a weapon. That's not true. But any satellite that's created to do active debris removal or, close approach on orbit servicing, that sort of thing, then yes, there is the possibility and that it could be used in a different way in which it had been initially designed. We can call it dual use, dual purpose, however you want to look at it. And there's the possibility that it could be used in a threatening manner. And that's, again, where transparency, I think, is really important to share this sort of information. We include these sort of capabilities in the Secure World Global Counter Space Threat Assessment under co-orbital, as you said, Bruno. But I think that's also where it's important to have conversations. Okay, what do you need to see in terms of if another actor is doing active debris removal, what sort of information could they be sharing in order to demonstrate, okay, we have good intent. You know, we're just going up there to collect a dead spacecraft or what have you, or space debris. And, you know, do they share information ahead of time? Do they share, you know, when they're going to do it, how they're going to do it, where they're going to take the debris, that sort of thing. And so there was an initiative actually created by DARPA that had, it's a nonprofit called Confers, that works to get the commercial sector to talk about, okay, what are the best practices for on-orbit servicing, active debris removal, so that they can point out, okay, what does the community think is responsible behavior? And Confers has actually been very helpful. Secure World was part of it at the beginning, and since it spiraled off, be entirely all commercial actors. But you know, what does the commercial sector see as, you know, responsible behavior, and how can you share information about on-orbit servicing and active debris removal, that sort of thing. And that can help establish the precedent for a norm for countries to do that. But I think also it is shaped in terms of, you know, how you view the country doing this. There have been news stories just in the past couple weeks or so about a Japanese company, Astroscale. It's getting ready to do a close approach in terms of testing out debris removal, and it's imaged its target from about 50 meters, which is crazy. It's really impressive, the photographs. And I haven't seen anyone talk about Japan using that as a weapon. Good, you know, I mean, any active removal satellite could be used as a weapon. But I think that Japan's, how it's viewed internationally, that shapes how people view the space capabilities, or space capabilities of its commercial sector. Versus a few years ago, there was a dead Chinese satellite in geostationary orbit. It was shedding debris with some regularity, and China sent up a satellite to take it up to a pretty high graveyard orbit. And you could look at that in two different ways. You could say, you know, China's being a responsible space actor. It had a satellite in a very, as discussed earlier, geostationary orbit is a very tightly organized orbit. It's very valuable, and it was shedding debris and threatening other satellites. And so it's good that they did it. Or you can say China has demonstrated they've developed a co-orbital weapon. And so again, a lot of that, you know, where you stand on these things depends on where you sit and how you view these sort of capabilities. And again, so that's important to have a larger conversation about what's considered responsible behavior and how can you share information and be transparent as you can in sort of activities to avoid misunderstanding, miscalculations, and mistrust. Thanks.
Would you like to weigh on it, Doctor?
Bruno, I see the space debris problem as a real problem, not as a potential problem. Not only to the spacecraft, satellites, and the things in the outer space. I also see the problem to our society regarding the dependency on the technologies that satellite systems can give to our daily activities. So losing a space system due to the space debris it's a real problem. But we have other kinds of problem, like the one some scholars are trying to alert the general people about the aviation problem. With the increasing space activity, exponential launching and satellites posing on Earth orbit, there is a probability that some kind of space debris can affect the aviation. So I think it's a very important problem, and any technology that deals with this problem is welcome. But I think that we must not forget the responsible space programs, the responsibility of the states and the private sector regarding the space exploration, to follow all the safeguard procedures to avoid space debris, not only from ASAT tests, but also from the regular space activity. So I think this is my opinion. I think it's a real problem, and we must focus on the responsibility from the states and private sectors regarding this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And another member of the audience asks us, there is a lot of competition when it comes to space exploration. Is there any kind of limit that regulates space exploration and colonization movements? It could be to any of you. Do you see any limits to exploration, space exploration and colonization movements?
I can start at least. I mean, the Outer Space Treaty, obviously, Article 2 talks about you can't appropriate, space. It's meant to be for everyone. Article 4 limits putting a weapon mass destruction in orbit or on the moon or other celestial bodies, and also putting military installations on the moon or other celestial bodies. But other than that, I mean, not really. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think the Artists Accords, as mentioned earlier, is very helpful, because basically what it does is it pulls principles from the Outer Space Treaty and says, okay, here's how we see them applying to space exploration, and how the United States and other signatories to the Artists Accords view what can be considered peaceful exploration, and just adapting it to how things happen on the moon in terms of as mentioned earlier, safety zones. The reason why that was included in the Artists Accords is that dust is different on the moon, and it can be very damaging. And so getting close to another country's or another actor's base or installation can actually be very harmful to the machinery just from the dust. And so that's really what caused that. So I think that is, a helpful way in which to say, okay, these are the principles that we think are important and apply to this circumstance. I will point out that the International Lunar Research Station, which was mentioned earlier, the Russian-Chinese option to create programs to work together on the moon and eventually create a lunar base in the next decade. They have not shared what their principles are. They have shared, okay, if you want to sign on, here's the technical processes you can do, and they've shared what they plan on doing, but they haven't shared these are the principles that we think are important and key. Now, they both obviously signed the Outer Space Treaty. Russia was one of the initial, negotiators of that, and and they're working with the same laws of physics everyone else is. And so I would assume that they're fairly similar. But it would be really good. I urge China and Russia to improve transparency and share what their principles are. And the last note I'll make on that is that 43 countries have signed the Artists Accords, and only 11 have joined the ILRS. And perhaps this is because there is not something to grab onto in terms of what the principles are, and what they how do they view peaceful exploration on the moon and other celestial bodies. And so maybe sharing more information about what their view is and where they hope to go on that might help just move away from it has to be a competitive view where it's either Artists Accords or the National Lunar Research Station. They could be complementary, and I hope that they will be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruno, this is something that worries me a lot, and is the main reason of my presentation. I see the space exploration. Maybe we are in the earlier stages of this process as an historic and geopolitical movement to colonize, to conquest, to explore new political valuable regions with natural resources and territory. So this is something like the humankind make his history with movements of this kind of exploration. But I also believe in a more collaborative way to deal with this situation. That's why I expressed my feelings during the presentation about the ways we can collaborate, make this enormous, huge geographical space, certainly with very rich natural resource, a lot of opportunities to mankind, to be a place of peace and to be a place of economic development to our societies. But we must be aware and we must be alert to the situations and the complications of this exploration. So I think it's my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruno, can I follow up, please?
Sure, please.
Yeah, no, I just want to say I agree 100% with Dr. Valorosa. And actually, when I talk to reporters, often I get asked, is there a space race, and I'm like, to where, to what? But I truly believe the moon is a possibility where there can be some sort of, competition that could eventually lead to conflict. Not on the moon. Have you ever seen the TV show, The Space Force, where you have astronauts sabotaging each other? I don't see that actually happening, but I could see competition over resources or just geopolitical prestige on the moon leading to conflict on Earth. And so that's why I think it's really important to have these conversations, such as we're having today, and that are being held elsewhere about, what are the goals, what are the priorities, where do you want to go, and how can we work at this together? So it's a collaborative approach, not a competitive one. Because it can go either way. It doesn't have to. As we've seen, the point I would make is the International Space Station, over 24 years of having human beings continuously in orbit. And it was built specifically so that the US and Russia had to work together on the space station. And, they continued to work together through various Russia invading Ukraine twice, and and other issues that are the very geopolitically hostile, but they managed to maintain this scientific connection there and work together on this. The International Space Station is going away at the end of this decade, and I worry about there's nothing to replace it. And it's important to keep these connections because that's a way to build a foundation for, again, maybe not necessarily cooperation, but just discussion and coordination, because that needs to happen, whether or not you're an ally of other countries or a rival. We need to make sure we can coordinate activities so you don't have objects in lunar orbit interfering with other activities and that sort of thing. Thank you very much.
And Bruno, just for the record, the work Ms. Sanson and Mr. Whedon are doing in the annual report is an excellent tool for the knowledge of the challenge that we have dealing with the counter space capabilities. That's a very good instrument to understand the problem and to face the reality. So thank you very much for your collaboration.
Thank you.
Thank you both. There is another question here from our audience. It's a critical point of view, really interesting to approach. Considering that we haven't matured enough to live in a sustainable way on our planet Earth, how can we invest in the sustainability of space? So could we consider that part of the sustainability of space is solving some of our sustainability issues on Earth and just escalating them towards outer space? Are they connected? Coronel Valley, would you like to start? Just to vary?
Okay, thank you. Apart from the problems of debris and war in space that are something like hard thinking about the sustainable way to deal with these things, I think the space technology can give us a better understanding about the problems we have in Earth about living in an environmental place that the humanity can go forward. I told this during my presentation that the space technology gives humanity better knowledge about the Earth itself, not about the cosmos or the universe, but about Earth itself. Today we know better our problems. We know better our geography. We know better our environmental. So I think this is the great contribution of the space technology to a sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, that was really well put. I don't have much to add to what Dr. Villarosa said. And I realize we're getting near the end of our time, but I will point out it's not either or, it's not, space sustainability or Earth sustainability. I really, truly believe they're interwoven, intertwined, and you can't have one without using the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to express the happiness for being part of this event with all of you lecturers. Most of you were my professors or were mentors somehow, just like Victoria. She wasn't my professor literally, but she has been some kind of mentor around here. I really appreciate to be among such experts in the space policy field. And I also thank you, the UNIFA, Brazilian Air Force University, and the Center for Strategic Studies, Coronel Nogueira for leading us in this effort, Sargento Marcela to introducing the event, and thank you all. Please, Sargento Marcela, you have the words.
Thank you very much. Unanswered questions referred to the preceding lectures will be forwarded to the speakers to return to the audience. We would like to invite Lieutenant General Max Sintra Moreira, who will close the webinar, and later we will provide you with the final recommendations.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers and honored guests, as we draw this webinar to a close, I would like to express our gratitude to each one of you. I especially want to thank our partners and all participants. Your expertise and perspectives expanded our understanding of strategic dimensions of space security. The success of this webinar is a proof of the dedication and hard work of our team, from the Center for Strategic Studies and all the other departments of the Air Force University, whose efforts are truly commendable. I now officially declare the International Webinar on Space Security closed. Take care, and I hope to see you soon.
We would like to remind you that the certificates pertaining to this event will be sent to the emails informed at the time of registration only to those participants that confirm their presence through the link which is located in the video description. We expect to see you in the next opportunity. Keep in mind that this webinar will be available on the YouTube channel of the Brazilian Air Force University. And we wish you all a happy return to your respective office, expressing our deepest respect and appreciation for your presence and contribution today. We expect to see you soon. Brazilian Air Force, our strength wherever Brazil needs it. We wish you all a good day.